Chapter 4 is split into two main parts, weather and climate, and then we're going to talk about all the biomes, terrestrial and aquatic. So first, let's contrast what the difference between weather and climate. Weather is short term, all right? So it's measured, here's the key term, key factors here. It's measured over hours or days. It's very much shorter term than climate is. Climate is determined over a long period of time, usually at least 30 years. Okay, so that's usually what they base an area's climate off of. And we're going to talk about why it's different in different parts of the world. It's mostly because of global air and the movement of that air and ocean currents. Okay, this is a biggie right here, the Coriolis effect. The Coriolis effect it was discovered, he was identified and kind of described by Gaspard Gustave de Coriolis. I don't know, I tried. Back in the 1800s, and it's all because Earth rotates. Because of that, any moving object is going to move off to the side because of Earth's rotation. Now, the northern hemisphere winds deflect things to the right, so clockwise. Southern hemisphere in the southern hemisphere, the winds deflect to the left, so counterclockwise. I will post a video that will kind of reinforce this understanding, and you can visualize it a little better. All right, so convection currents are another biggie. So the solar energy, it's a thing, right? So solar energy is very important. It's what warms the earth. We know this. But here's the thing. That's through the process of radiation. It's radiant heat. And it enters up through to the atmosphere. Now you also know that hot air does what? It rises. Cool air does what? It sinks. So we end up with these convection currents, and hot air rises, and what happens is that it a lot of times will release heat and moisture in terms of rain and other forms of precipitation. That's over here on this right hand side. But then whenever it starts to become cooler, it becomes more dense and it sinks. And then a lot of times if it kind of interacts with warm air or moist air in that process, that's where we get rain and storms again. All right, so winds are a major factor whenever it comes to an area's climate. So we have these currents of air, and they move at very fast rates and very high speeds through the atmosphere. And what happens is as warm air goes up, because we'd already talked about that, and cooler air flows along Earth's surface in the warm air's place. So in other words, it takes the place of where that warm air was once it rose. And this really does help to kind of keep things on nice and temperate in certain areas. Think San Diego. If you've ever been to San Diego, they get beautiful surface winds coming off of the ocean there, off the Pacific, and it really does help mitigate their climate. Dew point is a thing that meteorologists, you hear them talk about, but not a lot of people really understand it. So dew point has to do with how much moist air is in the atmosphere, and it talks about it's like the energy it has to cool for it to condense into liquid water. And this is what helps create clouds and dew point on grass and things like that. Precipitation. Now, we all know that is a part of the hydrologic cycle. We know that now. And so precipitation occurs basically because the condensated water becomes heavy and it falls to the earth. Thank you, gravity. But It can come in different forms. We all know this. It can be frozen. It can be liquid. So frozen types would include sleet, snow, hail. Hail happens to occur in warmer weather, though. And so here in our part of the country, we get hail. Yep, we do. And this does happen where we talked about those convection currents. That's where that occurs, is because you have the meeting, the coming together of warm and cool air. They don't get along. And then that's usually whenever we get some form of precipitation. Okay, so there are convection cells that are distributed around our planet. And if you think about a globe, on the next slide, I'll kind of walk you through them. And there's three names. There's the Hadley, the Ferrel, and the Polar. I bet you can guess where the polar cells are. What this does is this really creates major patterns of climate in biomes all around the globe. And so here, let me kind of show you. I apologize, this is not the clearest picture. Okay. So here what we have is in the red, these are what we call the Hadley cells. So they're closest right up here to the equator. What they do is, remember, warm air rises. So warm air rises from near the equator up, and it goes north when it's in the northern hemisphere. And when it's here in the southern hemisphere, it goes south, all right? And then as it cools, because it's changing its area, right here, it's getting to about 30 degrees south or 30 degrees north. And then what happens there in terms of these latitudes, it's like a magic number. That air gets cooler because up here you're not getting as much direct sunlight. And it sinks, and then it flows back, warms back up, all right? So this is what we call the Hadley cell. So these are the ones that are closest to the equator, between the equator and 30 degrees north and south of the equator. Within here, this is where we have what we call the trade winds. Now, the next ones, closer to kind of where we live, is within the Ferrel cell. And in the Ferrel cell, what happens here is you have their rising air actually occurs almost closer up to the poles. And as it rises up to the poles here, part of it comes back down towards where a little bit lower down in the latitude, right? So here, about 60 degrees, it rises, comes back up, and then it comes back down. And then that's about 40 degrees north, it starts to sink again. And so we have this movement in the Ferrel cells. And we have the westerly winds in this area. Now, we also have the polars. And the polars, yep, you guessed it, they're at the poles. So where the air rises here, with the Ferrel cell, it also rises in the polar cell, moves up towards the pole, and then sinks back down again. Because think about it. The poles are going to be the coldest. That's where the air is going to sink. Cold air sinks, right? Okay, and remember, this is all comparison to the air around it. Yes. So that's the basics of the wind currents in the convection cells. Now, what happens in 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south? Whenever in right here where it's split and there's not, it looks like westerlies, ooh, windy, ooh, trade winds, windy, ooh, the polar easterlies, windy. Well, here, this is where we start to not have a lot of strong winds, and sailors back in the day did not want to get stuck there. Thus the doldrums. Okay, so Hadley cells, here's a little bit more information about them. So they are highly dependent on this. They're one of the major reasons why we have tropical rainforests. And this is also why we have deserts at around 30 degrees north and south. So 30 degrees north and south, where that air sinks back down, we have this little gap here, and that creates deserts. Yeah, cool, huh? So here you can kind of see, I like this picture too. as you can see the different cells. So which would these be? Which would these be? Your Hadley cells. Good job. So you can see the Hadley cell movement, the Ferrel cell movement, and the polar cell movement, and how these relate to some of the different biomes. Now notice where there's kind of this gap, that's where our deserts tend to be. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So let's talk about these air currents a little bit more. We know wind is air that moves. Yes, but why? It's because of pressure, and it's because there's unequal heating in the atmosphere. Obviously, we know around the equator we get more direct sunlight, and dependent on whether what season it is, summer or winter, if we are pointed more towards the sun or away from the sun. And this also changes with the pressure from high to low as well. So you'll notice on the weather, you'll see, oh, we're in a high pressure area. Usually that means no clouds. Oh, we're in a low pressure area. Typically we have a lot more clouds because we have a lot of air movement through there, and a lot of temperature change as well in the air. Trade winds. So the trade winds are very important, and as I kind of mentioned with the sailors earlier, they are extremely important when it comes to mitigating and moving and human movement along across the oceans is very important. And we kind of talked about, we're on that prior map where they were located. All right, so here you can kind of see, so like if you were to take off from, let's say, South America, you would have that, you'd kind of ride it out up here, and then you would hope to kind of get a hold of one of these equatorial currents and hope these, these trade winds kind of pull you in there, and you really get going as you would move towards Asia or Australia. Westerlies. Westerlies are the moving air masses that are between the 30 degree and the 60 degree. And these are because of the Coriolis effect. So whenever we talk about the Coriolis effect, just remember the westerlies are a result of that. The polar easterlies. These wind patterns are again similar, and they're caused by forces similar to the Coriolis effect. They don't take up, we don't really focus on them as much because it's not like a lot of people live at the poles, and so they haven't done as much research there on this. And you can see here where they, which direction they move in the northern and the southern hemispheres. So here is one more quick little look at what we got going on. So we have solar energy. It hits more directly along the equator. You can see how the trade winds, the directions that they move, the directions of the westerlies. Okay. You can see here where we have our major latitude lines and how those cells really do affect everything. So this is a nice slide to kind of pause on and maybe jot down, make notes off of. Yep. Screenshot it, keep it for later. Yeah. All right, so horse latitudes. These are what we call subtropical highs. Air movement is not nearly as predictable. It could be dead for days. And this is where I was kind of pointing to, again, on one of those prior pictures. So it's between 30 and 35 degrees. So kind of along this line here, okay, and here. And those horse latitudes, if you were a ship and you got stuck there, they called them the horse latitudes because there wasn't a lot of air movement. And if a ship got stuck and they had animals on board and they died, they had to throw them overboard, and they would find dead animals floating in the water in these areas because there was lack of winds. And then we also have our intertropical convergence zone, the ITCZ. We also call this the doldrums. And this is here near around the equator. I am running out of room on my 15 minutes. So you can see where it occurs, and I will stop it here.